My name is Irena Swanson, and today I want to show you how to make flying geese very accurately, easily and fast using the method that I call two-piecing. Actually, we won't be making just individual blocks of flying geese, we will be making flights of flying geese. So these dark green flights each have 16 flying geese blocks in them. And the four of them together with traditional methods would require 188 seams. But I'll show you how to make these 4 flights with only 24 seams. The center here was made in the same way, but here there is no seam between adjacent flying geese blocks. Instead, I leave a gap here so I can cut into flights. In fact, that's how the green flights were made. And I'll show you how we can control for these gaps. If you want the gap to be 0, that is just rows of triangles, and I have another video for making rows of triangles. Today we're making flying geese blocks, so we want to have these gaps of a certain width there. The same principle here was used on this quilt here. The fabrics here are hand-dyed by Stitch and Dye. It's beautiful. Okay, so let's get started. Two-piecing is an enhancement of strip piecing, so we start from strips. The longer the strips, the more efficient the method. I typically cut the strips from selvage to selvage, and I do not remove the selvages when I first sew the strip set. The width of the flying geese strips, so dark, can be anything. For these I used the strip width 4 3/4 of an inch. And then for the background, for the sky fabrics, you want those to be at least 1 inch wider than the geese blocks. Mathematically speaking, you can get away with 3/4 of an inch wider, but to accommodate any wobbles in cutting, pressing, sewing, you probably want this width to be 7/8 of an inch, 1 inch wider. 1 inch, I recommend 1 inch. Once you sew all the strips together, then you press seam allowances either all towards the goose fabrics or all away from the goose fabrics. I'll talk about the pressing schemes later. And once it's pressed, the strip set is pressed, then you trim the top perpendicular to all the seams. I'm just pretending here. And then we sew the 2 outside strips together, matching the beginnings. And what we get is a tube. Here is such a tube. The last seam was pressed in the same pattern. Here it's a tube. And then I turned it inside out. I call this tube a primary wide tube because it's the first tube that appears, and it's a wide tube. There will be other tubes that appear later. From this primary wide tube, I cut out primary narrow tubes, and the width of these is the same as the cutting width for the goose strips. Yeah? So again, these are 4 3/4 for here, and these are 5 3/4. Okay. Now we will sew these tubes together. My tubes are always at least 22 inches in circumference, so it's easy to sew them together. And we will line up the goose squares either from the northeast to southwest, or we will go from, or we will line them up from southeast to northwest, so there will be matches here. How do we decide which one? Well, that depends on the pressing scheme that we did earlier. Whether we match them this way or that way, in either case the seam allowances will butt against each other, which is good. But it's much easier to sew and to get accurate points if the seam allowance on top of the sewing is pushed against the flow of sewing, so that when feed dogs come down here, they push against the other seam, pressed seam, and so it makes these points very accurate. Okay? So we want to press, we want to sew all these narrow tubes together. Here the diagonals are obvious, right? Okay. And here is another example. So the reason for making these diagonals is it makes all of these swaths straight lines, but we will destroy these diagonals in a few minutes, right? And again, the background, the sky fabric is wider, so we have these overlaps here. We match here, and the rest goes along for a ride. And then we pick one of these sky diagonals and we mark with a ruler and pencil that straight line, and then I cut here with scissors. If the tube is deeper here, or if it's narrower, then I might be able to put inside a small rotary cutting mat and cut with a rotary cutter, but as it is, I cut with scissors. I cut here, and I continued cutting. And so when this cut is complete, what we get is a parallelogram. Here you're looking at it from the back side. And again, I want to emphasize this edge and that edge are from the X narrow tubes, and the latest cut is through the swath, the buffer of sky fabric. Here is another such parallelogram. Well, I did extra things to it. Right? So here are the X narrow tubes, and the last cut separated here on the left and right now. And then I take all the other sky fabrics and I cut through the sky fabrics. And then the other thing that I do is, remember all those carefully aligned square points? Now I cut through those. Actually, I don't cut, I only slit. I stop my cuts within an inch, half an inch of the edges. I do not complete it. And why is that? So suppose that we cut all the way. If we cut all the way, then we get rows like this. And here you can already see flying geese blocks. But this flying goose block is not complete. The missing part is here. So what we could do is sew these together. But it is possible to get this done accurately, but it's very difficult or not doable. It's time consuming to make it so that after seaming, this here is as aligned as the rest of this edge here. So we want to avoid the difficult seams. We want to use those goose points to help us make this last, the next seam here. So again, rather than cutting into those rows, we slit. And just like over there, as I was pointing out, we want this goose to be completed up here and this goose to be completed down there. So we want to sew this bottom edge to the top edge, so this goes up here. And because I did not cut away these, oops, I'm doing it the wrong way. This is up here. Because I did not cut away these square points, I did not cut all the way, I still have these easy markers that made the previous seams between the narrow tubes easy. I have the same type of easy seam now. It may look complicated here. In fact, the next step may look a little funky. So this is what you see. This is how we sew this last seam. All right. Let me show it to you from a different perspective. So here you see all the slits, and this is that last seam. I lined it up, so if I hold it up like this, and this is from the right side, it would be a little seam like that. It would look just like what this looks like. Okay, so just like what this looks like. Now here, let me open this up. Alright, so what is happening, we get pretty much what is here. And here we have two slits coming together. Now all we have to do is extend that slit into a full cut. Go through the point. And then also extend all of these. And here and now I liberated one of these tubes. Okay. I have already liberated a few of them before. So here are two of them, and there are four more. So maybe they came off this way, and then we probably want to sew them together like this to form flights here. All right. So when we form the flights, what we want to make sure is that this tip of one flying goose matches the middle of this base here. So we somehow need to mark the base. So there are many ways of marking the halfway middles between these. I do what I call mass marking. So there are four tubes lined up here, and I am exaggerating how much I stagger them. Normally I only stagger them about 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch away from each other. Here I'm making sure that you can see the pointy things, so they're staggered about a little bit, some of them a little more than 1/4 of an inch. But they're lined up. Here the points match up perpendicularly. So in other words, I don't want to do this. I want to line them up. Okay. And when I have them lined up like this, then I take a ruler, make it perpendicular to the raw edge, and when it passes through the line, I mark through all of these exposed edges. I mark the center, and I mark through all of these centers. So in this way I mark that way, and then I have to turn around to mark the other side of the narrow tubes as well, and I have to stagger them again. And once we have the marks, and this is the only place where I first pin before I sew, I put these two together and I push my pin through the tip of goose in one point, and I pin it where the mark in the middle of the base of the other goose in the next row, and I pin all the way around, and then I sew. Okay, so when I sew only two of these, I get something like this, beautifully aligned. And you can already start to see flights of flying geese. And here I cut out one flight of flying geese from a different tube like this. And when you have four of them, you can make a Flying Dutchman block. I like Flying Dutchman blocks. Here are a few more of them. Aren't they beautiful? Alright, so this is if you sew two of these narrow tubes together. But what if you sew more than two of them together? Well, you get something like this. And then what you do, just like over there, we cut one flight out. So here we will cut through one of these flights, the gaps between the flights. And I already did that. So here on the back side, I already did the cut. And then when I open it up and point it the right way, you get, well, possibly a completed quilt top. You saw that I already have enough material so I can make more rows, and then that could be a nice baby quilt. Right? So this is how this part here was made, and then we could take this and cut down the middles of the other flights, and then we could get these here. Or another thing that I often do if I want longer flights, I cut it down halfway here. If if I cut halfway here, and then I get 3 flights here, 3 flights there, I get 2 halves, and I could sew this half to the top of the other half, and then I get higher flights. Actually, this is the next step here. Alright, so in this way, I produced a few more constructions. So while I was preparing for this yesterday and the day before, I made this in a similar way. So over here the blues are horizontal and the reds are vertical. Here the blue flying geese are vertical, and the red flying geese are horizontal. So here the reason I wanted to show this, because in my regular construction of flying geese, as you saw, these edges here, these edges are all on bias. And people are afraid of bias because bias stretches quite a bit. However, with only 24 seams for these, you have very little opportunity for stretching. There's just not enough handling to stretch. So it's much easier to do it this way, and it's also much faster. I hope I convinced you of this. Right. Now I want to talk a little bit more about the widths of these gaps. So if we go back to the cutting here through, so we have to cut through the middles of all the sky fabrics, and then I also cut through these centers of geese, so the geese bulk. Now when I do that, there's still quite a bit of bulk here, and this bulk, so the geese will be like this, the bulk would be here, right? So if we want to avoid that bulk, then rather than cutting through the middles of that geese fabric, we slit at some distance, possibly 1/4 of an inch, on either side of the goose fabric. So here the sky fabric is yellow and the goose fabric is green, dark. So now this bulk here that happens through the points, so here we have that bulk at the points, now the bulk is taken away. At the same time, we also reduce the height, so the height here is smaller than the height there, but we removed the bulk. And we increased the gap. We increased the gap here. Okay, so you have to decide whether you are willing to deal with the bulk or not, or whether you want bigger height or smaller height, and all of this can be calculated ahead of time. Now these little things here, well, that's not very usable, except for, look at these beautiful points that are here. You can make beautiful Christmas or greeting cards, I should say. All right. So I hope this convinces you that two-piecing is a very fast and streamlined way of making many quilt blocks, and in particular these flying geese constructions. Thank you for watching.